One of the things that I specialise in, and I teach teams in companies and I coach senior people in and sometimes do keynotes on, is creativity and creative thinking in business. The tradition when people are talking about creative thinking is to talk about what has become referred to as right brain thinking, i.e. intuitive thinking, things that are about the moment of insight, the aha moment. I do use that, and the great champions of that kind of thinking are people like Edward de Bono, and I'm a huge fan of Edward de Bono. But there is another way of thinking creatively as well. It doesn't all have to be about that moment of magical perception. You can use your left brain as well, i.e. the more analytical, number-crunching, rational side of your brain, just as creatively. So what I try to do when I'm helping people to become more creative is to use both sides of their brain. Now, happily, I discovered not very long ago a beautiful book on that subject, which is this book, A Whole New Mind, by Daniel H. Pink. And he gives, I think, the best articulation of why it's not sufficient to assume that you can only be creative with the right side of your brain. And that really the trick is to bring those two things together, because they function quite differently from each other, at least in theory. What happens, it seems, is that with the right side of our brain, we deal holistically with things. So when we look at somebody's face for the first time, a new person we've met, we don't try and analyse it. We make instinctive, instant, holistic judgments of the whole. We decide whether we like them or not. We decide whether to move towards them or away from them, which accounts for why people can say, across a crowded room, I'm going to marry that girl. But with the left side of our brain, we tend to be more analytical. We break things down into pictures. And it's the left side of our brain that we tend to use when we're learning languages, for example, or when we're doing the accounts, that kind of thing. But the magic, the real great insight into creative thinking, I think, which Daniel Pink has articulated, is that using those two things together is the point. So when I teach creative thinking, I teach people strategies and exercises that get them to use the left side of their brain first, the analytical side. So in other words, you take everything you think you know about your topic, about your challenge, your problem, your business, let's say, and you analyse it. But you try and analyse it from a different direction. I don't mean analyse it in a number-crunching way. I mean analyse it in the sense of breaking it down into small pieces and managing it. And I use a technique called morphological analysis for that, which sounds scientific, actually comes out of astrophysics, but is really easy to use. But once you've done the analysis, you can then apply the more Edward de Bono lateral thinking intuitive approach, which gives you an almost poetic glance at something that previously was quite scientific. So you're almost mixing the poetic and the scientific in a really productive way. So I teach people techniques for doing that. When I first began doing it, people thought it was something nice to do, but they weren't convinced that it was desperately important. So in other words, a company might have initially hired me for an away day for their staff because they'd say, this might be a fun thing to do. And I've resisted that notion that it's just fluff, it's just fun, because it isn't. Now the reason it isn't is most beautifully explained in another of my favourite books of the last 12 months, really, called The Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who is a fascinating character, for one thing. He's part stock market trader, part philosopher, part essayist, and part general irritator of other intellectuals. And he describes in this book the phenomenon of the black swan. The black swan is a metaphor, but it's a metaphor based on the very real fact that before Australia was discovered by the old world, everyone in Europe and the West thought that all swans were white, because they'd only ever seen white swans. So for hundreds of years, we'd known what swans were, and we had a very firm picture in our minds that swans were white. Of course, as soon as Western people went to Australia, they discovered all swans are not white. Suddenly, the whole paradigm has shifted. Everything has changed. Suddenly, we know that there's the black swan. Now, the point about it is not just we've discovered something new. The point is we have very, very fixed ideas, and in an instant they can be changed. There's a nice story about the life of a turkey in the book. And the life of a turkey is a very happy one, generally speaking, if it's a free-range turkey, let's say. For something like 1,000 days, the turkey struts around the farmyard.